We're going to start now our next program. We're right on time and actually doing very well. I wanted to make a couple quick announcements first. After this program, Rick Levin's update is at 4:30. At 5 o'clock, there's a celebration of Yale singing. All that is at Woolsey Hall. Our cocktails begin at 6:30, and dinner is at 7:30. I'd like to call on Barry Bardo to make the introduction. Barry has served as our attendance chair. Barry has charted attendance, called people, gotten people to make calls. So, Barry, would you come up, please, and make the announcement?
Thank you. We hope to be announcing a record total later this evening as we have the walk-ons come in and we get our complete number as of about 7 o'clock on this evening. But I have the privilege today to introduce an old friend of mine, an esteemed colleague in a way. We've done a few volunteer projects together where he's been the performer, he and his musicians. And I recall that as I would walk by his rooms in Wright Hall and Branford College, occasionally I would hear the music blaring, and I'd look inside and I see John waving his arms, conducting a Wagnerian opera or a Broadway show. And it was pretty obvious to all of us at that point that music was John's passion, and so it's been ever since. While studying for his Master of Philosophy degree at Yale, he was appointed to the faculty in 1968 and served here for 15 years. During that time, he took the fledgling Yale Symphony Orchestra and developed it into a world-class undergraduate entourage that basically toured Japan, Brazil, and other countries and became a standard by which other college orchestras or university-based orchestras are still measured. I interview kids for Yale, and one of my kids is a supreme pianist. And he said he picked Yale over Stanford because the dress rehearsal of the Yale Symphony Orchestra was better than the concert performance, no offense, of the Stanford University Orchestra. While still at Yale, John went on to conduct on the world stage. He has conducted more than 25 of the world's greatest opera companies and more than 50 of the world's greatest symphony orchestras. He's the former music director of 4 opera companies and the first American to hold that position in both Italy and Great Britain. He was the first music director of the American Symphony Orchestra in Carnegie Hall, following in the footsteps of its founding director, Leopold Stokowski. John famously worked with Leonard Bernstein from 1972 until the composer's death in 1990. As assistant, as editor, and conductor of many of Bernstein's premieres. John's recorded more than 75 CDs, produced and or served as music director for numerous Broadway shows, and has conducted the score to the film version of Evita starring Madonna. And yes, he does know a lot of famous people. John's numerous awards include a Tony, a Grammy, an Olivier, 2 Emmys, and several significant international awards. John is the founding director of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, a position created for him by the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. And in 16 seasons at the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, John conducted 350 concerts before a combined live audience of 4 million people. And I can tell you, if you live anywhere near Southern California, as I do now, everybody winds up at the Hollywood Bowl concert sooner or later. They're great fun. They're outdoors, under the stars, a lot of fun. And John was kind enough to take me and some groups that I brought into the green room, and we met some of his performing artists, and it's a great experience. And the picnics are good, too. For the past 6 years, John has been chancellor of the University of North Carolina's School of the Arts, which is unique in being a publicly supported conservatory teaching music, of course, drama, dance, filmmaking, and design and production to high school and college as well as graduate students. As a frequent writer on American music, John's been a principal force in the preservation of the American musical. And also he's worked to preserve music, American music, and other banned by the Third Reich. And he's a particular champion of preserving the music of the American cinema. Today for us, he will present the Hollywood sound, what it is and how it works, with music and video clips and a very personal narrative that I know you're going to enjoy. So we'll have a brief question and answer period after his presentation. So now I'm very proud to present my friend, my classmate, our classmate, Chancellor and Maestro, John Mauceri.
Well, thank you, Barry. I think 35 years ago, when everyone in this room went to the movies, I know what you saw, but you certainly heard this. I should tell you, the story of movie music is a vast, complex one. With 45 minutes to tell you this gigantic story, I'm going to do the best I can to jump through this to give you some kind of sense. This on the screen now is the actual source of Star Wars. It is the reference that was made. I should tell you also that that first fanfare, the 20th Century Fox fanfare, was composed by Alfred Newman, who was born in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the eldest son of a Ukrainian butcher and his wife. As the oldest child, he showed great proclivity as a pianist, and he would take his parents didn't have enough money to give him lessons, and he was able to ride the New Haven Railroad to New York for piano lessons, and the conductor of the train let him use one ticket for many years, and it was the nicest thing a conductor ever did for a composer, let me tell you. After that, you heard music by John Williams, but what you probably don't know, you might know, but if your parents or grandparents were going to the movies on a Saturday, they would have seen this.
You've got to. It's our only chance. I've got to destroy him. Ling won't forgive another failure.
Now, you might have noticed that the music never stopped, and that the music was in a certain style. And that music was composed by Franz Waxman, who was born in what we used to call Upper Silesia, who was trained in Berlin, who escaped from the Nazis through Paris and then to Los Angeles, where he composed over 150 film scores. Part of the story of who the composers were who created the sound of Hollywood is absolutely linked to the story of World War II and the racial policies of the Nazis. Almost without exception, every composer who wrote in that era, who was actually creating the sound of Hollywood, was an emigre or refugee Jewish composer from part of Europe in which they would have been killed. Their music had been banned. They found a way out. They came to Hollywood at exactly the time that there was this tremendous need for new music, for a new medium, which was talking pictures. But let's go back a little further. What you just saw from Flash Gordon was from, in that case, 1941, but this series had started in the late 30s. But if you go back to 1925, that was when the time of what we call silent movies. But the point about silent movies is they were actually never silent. Here's a clip from Lon Chaney, The Phantom of the Opera, 1925. Now, if you were going to the movies in a large movie theater, there would be a large organ playing to accompany silent pictures. If you were in a smaller theater, there'd be someone playing a piano. In the great movie palaces, occasionally there was an orchestra. But there were two reasons for music in silent movies. One was a simple technical reality. The sound of the projector was so loud, those projectors went, and it was also a way of abrogating the general sound of an audience, which was distracting. But the second part, which is the most mysterious, is the effect that music has on the way we see things. Movies are basically an art of montage. There's a close-up, there's a medium shot, there's a long shot. They're constantly being edited back and forth. And without music, the eye seems to see all these disjointed images, but with music, they're kind of glued together in a way that allows you to think of the whole thing as being totally organic. But in 1927, and a few years after that, the ability was finally found to put synchronized sound onto a picture. Therefore, actors could speak, the audience could hear them. And so producers thought there was no longer a need for music. The music, after all, was working for silent movies. So music was only being used for musicals. And a musical, in those days, was always a story, a backstage story about a Broadway play. So when there was a song, people were simply performing a song. But there was no music under a dialogue scene. There was no music to carry you from here to there to set the tone. Here's a couple, I'll give you an example of an early talking picture. Again, keeping the genre to horror movies, it just seemed to be an easier way to go. This is from 1931. If you saw, for example, the original talking Dracula movie made by Universal, there's only music at the very beginning, and it's music from the second act of Swan Lake, and then there's no music to the end. In the case of Frankenstein, directed by James Whale, there's no music at all, and this is the final minute of the movie of Frankenstein, and all you will hear, besides Boris Karloff as the monster screaming with the fire, sound effects of fire, sound effects of men shouting, the people who have come to burn down the mill, and the sound of dogs. There's no music. 1931, Frankenstein. somewhere between 1931 and the next clip, which I'm going to show you from 1935, something amazing happened. All of the composers who were in Hollywood who were doing the musicals were all sent back to Broadway because they were no longer needed except for songs. One composer by the name of Max Steiner, who had studied with Gustav Mahler as a boy in Vienna, had a longer contract, and he, since he was there and there was a contract orchestra, he made a suggestion to the producers. He said, I would like to try writing music under a dialogue scene. It happened to be for a Western. Now, the American producers said, why would you ever want to have music playing in a Western? I mean, people will think there's an orchestra out there in Arizona. And Steiner said, no, let me just underscore the dialogue scene and you'll see the difference it makes. So the experiment happened and all the producers said, oh my God, it's better. And as a result, the entire industry of music composing for dramatic movies shifted. And that Max Steiner went on to write 350 film scores, including Gone with the Wind. Now, let me show you what happened in the Frankenstein series, because the next Frankenstein movies from the very same studio, Universal, is Bride of Frankenstein. Now, they hired a young German composer, Franz Waxman, and the music never stops. I'll begin at the end of the first scene of that movie where Mary Shelley and her husband and Lord Byron are together in a not modest house, a Hollywood house for them, in which she is going to tell the rest of the story. Notice at the beginning the music is a minuet because she's supposed to be a fine lady, and then when we continue the story, the music never stops. Bride of Frankenstein, 1935.
There. I do think it a shame, Mary, to end your story quite so suddenly.
That wasn't the end at all. Would you like to hear what happened after that? I feel like telling you. It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
I'm all ears. While heaven blasts the night without, open up your pits of hell.
Well then, imagine yourself standing by the wreckage of the mill. The fire is dying down.
Well, I must say, that's the best fire I ever saw in all my life.
Come home, Hans. The monster is dead now. Nothing could be left alive in that furnace. Why do you stay here?
I want to see with my own eyes.
Oh, Hans, he must be dead. And dead or alive, nothing can bring our little Maria back to us.
I can see his blackened bones. I can sleep at night.
Come back, Hans! You will be burned yourself. Maria drowned to death and you burned up. What should I do then?
The heartbeat. The monster's face. Tension. Little atonal music.
Hans! Where are you? Hans! Are you all right? I hear you. Here, give me your hand, Hans. Here. Oh!
And then the joke ending, Una O'Connor and a clarinet. Now, Franz Waxman, working as the composer, working with the director and the movie, has told you exactly what to feel. Where does this come from, this idea of underscoring dialogue? Well, why would it be normal for a Max Steiner or a Franz Waxman or Dmitri Tiomkin or the others to just know this was normal? Well, it turns out, which is very little known today, is that there was a whole branch of dramatic theater that used orchestras playing in the pit to accompany dramatic plays. Almost everybody here certainly knows of Midsummer Night's Dream by Mendelssohn, but no one in this room has ever seen A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare fully staged with an orchestra in the pit accompanying, playing an overture, playing scene changes, because it's played by orchestras in concerts. But in point of fact, there's a great tradition of what's called melodramas. Here's there's about 2 minutes of examples. Here's one from 1810. It's Beethoven.
Ungebeten, unerfleht, am billigsten. Du lösest die Knoten der strengen Gedanken, vermischest alle Bilder der Freude und des Schmerzes.
That's 1810. 150 years later, it's still going on. Here's Shostakovich.
Быть или не быть? Вот в чем вопрос.
And translated into English from a performance of the same score that I did with some of my students.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more.
And
Jamil,
then
do you mind if I say a few words?
something from
Thank
Hollywood,
you.
1951.
I just want to tell you all how happy I am to be back in the studio, making a picture again. You don't know how much I've missed all of you. And I promise you I'll never desert you again. Because after Salome, we'll make another picture and another picture. You see, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us. And the cameras. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Now, that was the concluding moments from Sunset Boulevard. You know, the thing about Western music, which has developed over thousands of years, that makes it unique, is that it's found a way to describe things. Music, of course, has been on the planet as long as there have been humans. They've just found a flute that they've determined was 43,000 years old. And so we've been playing music since we were humans. But something about Western music, which is quite unique, is its ability to describe things. Not just put you in emotional states, or make you want to dance, or make you want to sleep, or make you feel closer to God, whatever those things are, but actually to describe things. Heaven, hell, hate, fear, a mountain. Now, this is an extraordinary and unique ability of the Western musical language. And where does it come to a kind of an apex? Just before the invention of talking pictures in the operas of Richard Wagner. It was Wagner who actually was accused of not actually writing music, but writing scenery. His critics didn't think he was writing pure music because he was describing a rainbow. He was describing clouds. He was describing, for the first time, carnal love. Now, this becomes really interesting because music in the West, especially church music, has found ways to describe religious love, the love of God, goodness, those things. And that usually defaults to whatever genius has found some way of describing it, and that then becomes the default lingua franca of music ever after. For example, a halo is described by divided strings. That's because Bach did that in his St. Matthew Passion. So when Jesus sings, there's just the strings holding a chord. And that was Bach's way of translating the concept of a halo into an oral representation. So forevermore, whenever those strings play, that's some kind of pure love. But Wagner was the one who not only described pure love in his opera Tannhäuser, but also carnal love. Literally, sexual intercourse and climax is described in his music. No wonder people found it so completely revolutionary, upsetting, disgusting, whatever. But this is the kind of language that is now being developed by the time there's movies. Richard Strauss, who followed Wagner in the German genre of opera, once said in his tone poems, I can describe the meal, the food on your plate, and I could probably even tell you with my music where your knife and fork is. This is an extraordinary thing. I think you don't necessarily believe it. I'm going to try and give you a couple of examples of how sensitive you are, whether or not you went to music school, or whether or not you can put this into words. I found a clip, because I couldn't find the original, to help us today, around the movie of the play by Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire. When A Streetcar Named Desire was turned into a movie, directed also by Elia Kazan, who went to Yale, and who had to transfer the stage play into a movie, he ran into a number of problems. First of all, since he hired Alex North to write a score for it, because a movie would need that musical environment. It would be quite odd not to have that, and he had this wonderful composer, born in Pennsylvania, again of Ukrainian parents. Their real name was Zoifer. They changed it to North because they moved north, and that is, of course, a whole other story, all of which I wish I could tell you, but I know I can't keep going on this. But anyway, Alex wrote the first jazz score to a movie. Before A Streetcar Named Desire, all scores kind of sounded like Star Wars, the German, Austrian, romantic music. But Alex North, who loved jazz, wrote a jazz score for this movie. The problem is that whether you like it or not, jazz has carried with it the images of the whorehouses of New Orleans, and no way out of that can you get the underlying principle of how we respond to this kind of jazz from the very place where jazz was invented. Is this the intentional fallacy? You can decide for your own. But here is a little clip from a documentary showing how the movie of A Streetcar Named Desire was released in 1951, and then in 1991, Kazan re-edited and then put back the original score. What happened was that Alex North had to rewrite the music to one scene, which transferred it from being a sexual scene in which Stella she has just been hit by her husband Stanley, just to remind you. She has been taken upstairs to the upstairs neighbors. Stanley, who's drunk, was pushed into the shower by his buddies. He's wet. He comes to. He realizes that he's hit his pregnant wife. He stands in the courtyard and yells the famous Stella. She's upstairs, and the girls and her sister says, don't listen to him. But she is so aroused by her husband's calling that she comes down the stairs. She embraces him, fingernails in the back, and she goes off, clearly to have sex with her husband. The Legion of Decency, Catholic Church, and others thought that this scene was obscene. And of course, the real meaning of obscene means offstage. All of you who have some recollection of Latin, obscena. That's why in all those great Greek and Roman plays, a messenger comes on to say what happened, which shouldn't be put on stage. You know, the queen, she's hanged herself. The king, he's gouged out his eyes. You don't see that. You just see it in your mind because a messenger. So that's obscene. Obscenity, how we define obscenity in any culture, actually tells us who we are. What is not worthy of being put on the stage? What is off stage, obscena. So I'm going to show you in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a restored version, and the lower right-hand corner, you'll see what was released, which then allowed the picture to be released, and every good Catholic could go see it without having to go to confession on Saturday. The most important part is listen to Alex North's original score with the wailing saxophone, and then you'll hear the second score, which uses the divided strings, i.e. the halo, and a harp, i.e. heaven, which makes the entire scene look different.
Hey, Stella! Hey, Stella!
And then, so you didn't see the expression on her face. That had to be played in a long shot. And then Alex North was brought in to literally rescore that particular scene.
The scoring he wrote originally was a very, sultry, evocative piece that worked just astoundingly well. I mean, it was shockingly emphatic to the scene and insightful into the lust that was the foundation of the relationship between Stella and Stanley. But of course, that ultimately was the problem. They came down with a ruling that this piece of instrumental music was too carnal and suggestive, and must be removed from the film. And so he ultimately had to rewrite the piece, predominantly revising it with a string orchestration, and that was what was included in the original theatrical cut of the film.
Believe me, baby.
Well, the original score is back. In fact, you can't buy this version, but it should be available just as an artifact of 1951 and what censorship. But also the power of music. I mean, this was decided that the first score was somehow obscene and inappropriate. So except for a couple of editing, this is the same movie that with one score was considered immoral, with the other score was a wife being returned to her husband to go off to play Scrabble, obviously. Now, just also to say how subtle this language is, that there's scary and there's even fake scary. Again, artists, people say, I don't know anything about music. That's nonsense. The average person knows far more about music than any time in history. You may not know the jargon. You may not know the words. You may not understand what a half diminished seventh chord is. But you absolutely understand because you're taught it from the day you're born. You're taught it your whole life. And in fact, one of the ironies of the racial policies of Hitler and the Third Reich was that the composers, who were German and Austrian, all of them Jews, all of them, had they not escaped, had they not come to Hollywood, had they not been the geniuses they were, fewer people would have ever heard their music, but in point of fact, hundreds of millions of people not only heard their music, but they actually just think of it as music. It's not anything except it's music. Here's an example of how subtle this language is. Again, the Frankenstein. The last of the Frankenstein series made by Universal, I think there were 14 of them, was Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein. Now, in this sequence, you will be told, not only by, of course, Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, but by the music when it's scary and when it's fake scary. The bloop bloop, that's a joke.
Give me some Dracula.
Now scary. harmonies tell you it's not serious. The pizzicato is fake scary. Doot, doot, doot.
Well, we got him.
Scary. Okay, so you see how this kind of works. Now, okay, so now I've told you a little bit about the language. I've told you a little bit about the history that it comes out of European theater. But now that we've done that, how does it function? All right, I talked to you about Wagner because Wagner was the one who found a way in musical terms to describe a rainbow, to describe magic fire, to describe that fire when it's good fire and when it's bad fire. He was able to change a harmony, change a color, and you would know what the intent was. But he did something else. He invented or developed, but let's say he invented the idea of what we now call the leitmotif technique. This is tapping into something that we do in our human brains, that in a drama, if a melody is inserted into your brain when a character appears on the stage, or a prop like a sword or a magic helmet, and there's a tune, you will forever hear that tune in terms of the magic helmet, in terms of the character. This linkage, this pasting of a musical motive onto a character or into a situation is the power, therefore, that a composer has of telling you that time has passed, of bringing somebody back, of memory, which after all in music is the only it's the only point of how you can make structure work. I mean, what does the return of a melody mean if you don't remember what it was? So I'm going to give you an example of how the power of memory and how the power of the leitmotif technique works in a movie. It will all take about 3 minutes of your time, but it will give you an idea of this incredible power. The music here is by Max Steiner, and it's from his most famous score and longest score, Gone with the Wind, which was released in 1939. So when the picture begins, you'll see the Selznick little sign there with a little fanfare, again, that Alfred Newman wrote, the same man from New Haven who wrote the Fox fanfare. And then you'll hear the fanfare that Steiner wrote. It's a little fanfare. It's a funny little thing in which he's telling you subliminally that we're in the South. It goes, bum, 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 which is, I wish I were in Dixie. That's what's happening. So he's not going, which would have been obvious. But instead he goes, bum, 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 and then it builds, 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 and then you hear the theme. That is the most important theme maybe he ever wrote. And when you hear that theme, the words travel across the screen, Gone with the Wind. The theme itself is based on the rhythm of Gone with the Wind. And it goes, Gone with the wind, gone with the wind. So you're hearing the theme. You've already been set up that it's in the South. And you're reading the text. Into the picture, we see Katie Scarlett O'Hara with her father. 10 minutes into the picture, and we hear the theme established with the words about land and the most amazing, memorable image of Tara, the plantation, the great tree in silhouette, and the father and the daughter as the camera pulls back.
I don't want Tara. Plantations don't mean anything when...
Do you mean to tell me, Katie Scarlett O'Hara, that land doesn't mean anything to you? Why, land is the only thing in the world worth working for. worth fighting for, worth dying for, because it's the only thing that lasts.
Oh, Paul, you talk like an Irishman.
It's proud I am that I'm Irish. And don't you be forgetting, Missy, that you're half Irish too. And to anyone with a drop of Irish blood in them, why, the land they live on is like their mother. Oh, but there, now you're just a child. It'll come to you, this love of the land. There's no getting away from it if you're Irish.
Now, an hour and a half later. Think of that for a minute. That's the length of most movies. An hour and a half later, and you have not heard the theme for an hour and a half. Now, Scarlett is in the ruins of the plantation. Everything's burned down. You will see what happens. Steiner, who again studied the Wagnerian techniques of adapting a melody and all of that, and remember, he was born in Vienna, and his father built the great Ferris wheel in Vienna. His grandfather was the one who owned all the theaters in Vienna and encouraged Johann Strauss to write the Fledermaus. This is a very wealthy Jewish family in Vienna where the young boy had learned to study violin and orchestration with Mahler. Now here he is in 1939 in America, and 1 hour and a half later, you start to hear that melody. Now it's in the minor mode, and when Scarlett says, "I'll never be hungry again," and it comes right back in defiant terms, we understand that time has passed, and we remember her father, we remember the beginning of the picture, and it is one of the great structural recapitulations in music. The Wagnerian development. Stress. Notice she landed with the chord. Now the music changes. She pulls herself together. She stands up.
God is my witness. As God is my witness, they're not going to lick me. I'm going to live through this, and when it's all over, I'll never be hungry again. No, nor any of my folk. If I have to lie, steal, cheat, or kill, as God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again.
Extraordinary. That was, of course, as you know, the end of part one of that enormous picture. Okay, so among other things, as I talked you through that, you notice that when she fell on the ground, that a chord hit just as she fell on the ground. And as she stood up, the music changed. And as the camera pulled back, the melody came in exactly the right place. So the question is, how do you get the music onto a picture? How do you get it in the right place? I mean, it's one thing to sit there and sort of play and noodle around, but how do you get exactly the right place? Now, one thing that you might not be aware of is that the last part of any feature film to be created is the music. An entire movie has been written, it's been shot, it's been edited, and then it goes to the composer. And the composer usually has the least amount of time to do his or her job because everyone wants to see it. Now, there's a person called a music editor. Nowadays, that music editor usually provides a temporary track for the director to see the picture with somebody else's music on it. This is a way for a director to kind of imagine what the finished picture is going to be like. And frequently, if the director falls in love with the temporary track, he will ask the composer to write it in that style. And that's why, by the way, John Williams wrote Star Wars in that style. They wanted the sound of the Flash Gordon serial. They wanted Waxman and Korngold. Sometimes I can watch Star Wars and know, oh, that's the beginning of the second part of The Rite of Spring. Oh, that's the March from the Love of Three Oranges of Prokofiev. Because that was the kind of music that the director and the producer wanted. And they also knew something, which was that when music is big and serious, it gives the big and serious nature to something that might otherwise be quite silly. Everyone actually knows that King Kong would not be anything but a stupid movie with a little rubber puppet that's playing a gigantic, monkey if it weren't for Steiner's score. Steiner's score said, this is a big monkey, even though, right? And as you probably know, that entire movie was done in stop action except for the one scene where the hand comes through the hotel window. That was the only thing that was actually built for that first King Kong movie. Okay, so how do you put the music onto the picture? I've got a little clip here of one of the older music editors telling you how it was done. First of all, when he talks about spotting a picture, that's a fundamental choice that the director and the composer makes as to where the music should start and where it should end. Now, some movies from the 30s, the music seems never to stop, but there's really significant moments where the music should come in and where it doesn't. I once asked Miklos Rozsa why there was no music during the chariot sequence in Ben-Hur. There's a whole sequence, if you look at Ben-Hur, before it starts, where the horses go around and there's a great march. This march makes that sequence look great, even though if you turn the sound off, it would be the dumbest thing you ever saw. Horses going around in a circle and horses going around in a circle. It goes on for 5 minutes. But the music says, wow, this is great. Once the actual chariot race begins, no music. The sound of whips, horses, the sound of the dirt and that going on. And he said to me the reason there was no music was because the director, William Wyler, didn't want it. And if you should look at this picture, note where the music does come in. That's after Masala is dragged under the wheels of the chariot and is about to die. And when he says the significant line to Ben-Hur that his mother and his sister are still alive, the music comes in and it makes it all the more powerful. So the first thing that you will do is spot a picture. Where does the music start and where does it end? Then comes the question of how does a conductor or the composer put the music on the soundtrack? Here's how it was done.
The general responsibility of the music editor is to work with the composer because he knows nothing about film. All he knows how to do is to write music, to write the sequences as he sees them, but what does he do with it? There's a lot of film work involved in this. The first thing is we have a small projection room where the director, the film editor, the composer, and the music editor will sit in, and we're going to spot the picture. Spotting means to decide where each cue is going to start and where it's going to end. This room is equipped in such a way that you can operate the projector yourself. You can start it and stop it and go backwards and so on and so forth. And we might run the picture and somebody would say, why don't we start at this particular scene cut? And I have to take all these notes that everybody says. Now, the composer may just decide this may be an overall cue, and he's just going to start at the beginning and going to go at the end. But in order for him to get the mood, he has to read all this material. If he decides that he wants to catch a certain action at a certain spot, then I have to mark that and put a streamer on to end on that particular frame. And punch a hole in it.